For those of you who are just tuning in or have been with us for a while, I'll remind you our course is called Revelation, End of the World, or Cause for Hope. And by the end of this, I hope you will come to see that Revelation calls us to a greater hope. The second class I've called Two Beasts. Last week, we considered Revelation 11, where we took... Actually, you know what? I did not write the same things last week. We're just going to talk about what we're going over. Oh, here we go. Last week, we considered Revelation chapter 12, that should say. I mistyped that, where we took a break in the three cycles of seven seals, trumpets, bowls, so that John may write of the overall cosmic battle between good and evil. It's almost as if a pause in the apocalypse were necessary so that it might be better explained how the human race became so corrupted. So there we read of a woman and a beast, a dragon rather, their cosmic struggle in heaven, that dragon's expulsion from heaven down to earth, and the dragon's continued efforts to destroy woman and her offspring. Our text ended last week on a cliffhanger. Then the dragon took his stand on the sand of the seashore. Chapter 13 describes the form and nature of the evils brought against the human race in the form of two word pictures, each depicting a different problematic aspect of Roman imperial power. Where we're going tonight, we'll be considering these two beasts that are summoned by the dragon in Revelation chapter 13, highlighting the various and most obvious symbolic imagery. We'll be spending all of our time, the next 20 minutes or so, on this chapter, not because there will be some theological or devotional payoff at the end, that will come in chapter 14 next week, but rather because here we have some of the more obvious examples of metaphorical imagery where their link to governments and history is more obvious. What do I mean by that? Well, I've been talking about word pictures, and I have been making the case from not my own case, but the case made by many biblical scholars that Revelation is a book filled with word pictures meant to convey symbolic imagery that would have made immediate access to John's initial audience. John wasn't writing to obscure, he was writing to, well, as the book is called, reveal, or the apocalypse means to disclose. And so he is not trying to be sneaky. The disconnect comes through the centuries and millennia of that have passed, where we have come to fail to understand these things. I've included on here, though, some modern examples of word pictures that we readily understand to give you a for instance of the sort of thing I'm talking about here. One up to your top left, you will know from our Revolutionary War, join or die. You have this snakes separated, and we know that each is symbolic of the colonies that are represented there with their little shorthand abbreviations. It says join or die. Now, if you were going to interpret this as some modern interpreters do interpret Revelation, you would say, well, the artist here is telling us that there's going to come a big old snake someday, and it's going to get chopped in half. And if you don't join the side of the snake, you will be put to death. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Oh, and the snake is going to embody certain attributes that represent certain states on the East Coast of the United States. What to make of that, we'll just debate it time in memoriam. You see the point. If you don't understand it as a word picture and metaphor, you fall into pretty literal interpretations that, for those of us who understand it, we think of it as rather silly. But we do that with Revelation all the time. There's a couple other examples here. You know that when they say that the market is a bull market or a bear market, you know that the market isn't literally a bull. So if somebody said, and I saw a bull rise from the East Coast or Manhattan Bay or the East River or something like that, something near Manhattan, and that bull charged through, whatever, I'm not going to make up a story here, but you would probably understand it as a metaphor for the market in the ways that which it's, running away in a good positive sense or declining in a negative sense. And of course, here to the left, we have a political cartoon of a donkey and an elephant playing Twister, showing the contortions that political parties make. However, if you were going to take this literally, as many people do with the word images in Revelation, we would come away with a quite bizarre and confusing interpretation. And I would imagine you'd get a different interpretation for nearly everyone who took a crack at it, which we often find with Revelation as well. I'm just trying to emphasize the point that Revelation is not trying to obscure, it's using word pictures. And the word pictures that we find today they operate as metaphor to disclose to the people the landscape the political landscape, the religious landscape, and also some other things about God's sovereignty and where God is taking everything. So let's get to it. These two beasts. And as I said too at the beginning, if you're looking for some like devotional theological payoff at the end here, like you would at the end of a sermon, you're not going to find it today. That's going to come next week in chapter 14. I really want to spend this week emphasizing the talking about these word pictures and making their connections to the Roman Empire, because this is one of the places where I think it's the most obvious and it's an easier point to make from this chapter. So that would be my goal. So let's pick it up where we left off last week. Chapter 12, verse 18. Then the dragon took his stand on the sand of the seashore, and I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, and on its horns were 10 diadems, and on its heads were blasphemous names. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And the dragon gave it his power and his throne and great authority. So here John represents both Rome and its emperors as a sea monster, which is common from the Hebrew canon and the apocryphal text. The sea monster Leviathan, often symbolic of tumultuous times, chaos. You can included several references here, one from Ezekiel, but the other two from some of the Jewish apocryphal texts. But when it rises out of the sea in Daniel, it's comprised of 4 different beasts. But here, it's like Daniel takes the author of Revelation takes those 4 beasts and combines them. The 4 beasts in Daniel represent Babylon, the Medes, Persia, and the Greeks, respectively. And that becomes clear in the book of Daniel itself. The idea here being John has taken all of these empires of old, or these symbols from empires of old, and combined it into one mega symbol of empire, implying that Rome embodies all of these things that have been read about in the prophets of old, and then some. Writes of this Brian Blunt, mythologically speaking, the sea and the abyss are functionally identical. They represent the lockdown region of chaos and the forces that penetrate it. The dragon, or Satan, calls the beast from the sea, which here represents the pit of hell. And up from such calamity is Rome called, apparently. The intention of this part of the apocalypse is clear. Rome, with its violence, cruelty, and persecution of the church, is satanic in nature. As I said earlier, you have combined the 4 creatures from Daniel chapter 7. You can read about those as they come out of the sea for that prophet. Reading from the more commentary from Brian Blunt, Daniel 7, 6 through 3 provides the inspiration for the next phase of the sea beast description. And here he's talking about the one in Revelation. It has the general appearance of a leopard, the feet of a bear, and the mouth of a lion. John presents these traits in reverse order from Daniel, who sees a lion, a bear, and a leopard. Daniel witnessed a 4th beast with the 10 horns John depicts in 13 verse 1. For Daniel, the 4 beasts represent empires that had conquered the people of God in a bestial manner. By folding all their attributes into the characterization of a single brute, John presses the narrative claim that this new beast is an imperial force without peer. So John is saying those empires of old that subjugated us and we made it through, this one is even greater. So we have several descriptions or images that by now I think should be rather familiar with us, from the throne room in heaven on through the dragon last week. Horns. Here we have 10 horns. This is hearkening back to the 10 horns on the head of the beast in Daniel 7, which there represents 10 kings. And these would presumptively represent the succession of Roman kings, each serving that same beast. Now, this beast has 10 horns that should be compared to the 7 of the lambs. Also, remember, horns mean power, symbolize power. The lamb has 7 horns, symbolizing a perfection and completeness to Christ's power. But in competition and in hubris, Rome claims to have more power, represented by its 10 horns. 10 diadems, along a similar vein. The diadems on the horns represent the beast's claim to be the King of Kings, a title John and his fellow believers, ascribe exclusively to Christ, who also wears many diadems on his head. Now, 7 heads. Later, John will relate these accoutrements directly to Rome in chapter 17. You can read that. Those seven heads are representative of the seven hills in Rome, and also here representative of seven emperors, and we'll get to that in a moment. But the seven hills, the seven heads that it represents, the seven hills of Rome, is plain and is made clear in this book of Revelation itself. Now, blasphemous names. Quoting Blunt, the blasphemous names on the beast's seven heads evoke images associated with Roman coinage. John's hearers and readers would regularly have seen the heads of emperors on imperial coins accompanied by titles in Greek like God or Son of God, Savior, or Lord. Since those titles and realities behind them belong only to the God and the Lamb, John regards their attribution to Roman emperors as blasphemy. Reading on, verse 3, one of its heads seemed to have received a death blow, but its fatal wound had been healed. In amazement, the whole earth followed the beast. They worshiped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like the beast and who can fight against it? There are two allusions made here, one about the big picture and the other in reference to an actual historical event. First, the big picture. On one hand, the death blow to one of the beast heads alludes to Rome's temporal fragility. It can be damaged despite its hubris, but its ability to rally and persist through its seeming demise alludes to its longevity, a zombie corpse that will not die. This image alludes to various times in Rome's history when it seemed to have been bested or was in some other form of decline. Its ability to persist brings more people under the empire's sway and influence. They fall to worshiping the empire's might, as no one seems able to best it. If you can't beat them, join them, as they say. But there is also a reference to an actual historical event, one such moment when Rome's power seemed fragile. It is probable that the head with the wound is a reference to the Emperor Nero, who reigned from the year 54 through 68. Blunt writes of this, the odds are high that John had Nero in mind. And as an aside, I think every commentary I read, and I read 5 this week on this passage, made mention of this. So it's a near consensus, and I'm talking from moderate leaning to conservative leaning commentaries, theologically speaking, not politically. Here I'm using theological conservatism, theological liberalism, and the ones that you would think of as more more, I don't know what the word I want to use here. Across the spectrum, though, this seemed to be what is intended here. Because in the year 68 CE, Nero committed suicide by cutting his throat, thereby committing a mortal wound to his head. But immediately rumors started to spread that Nero had not died, but had rather escaped to the east where he was better liked. It was thought that Nero would return to power, perhaps leading an army of Parthians with whom he had cultivated political alliances. They tended to like Nero in the east. They hated him in the west, where he lived, and in Italy, in the Italian peninsula. And think a modern corollary would be those rumors you get after the death of a celebrity, like Michael Jackson, still alive, Elvis, still alive, Hitler, still alive. People thought after World War II, there's rumors, because very few people had seen his body. And so this created these rumors. There was another rumor that held that Nero had indeed died, but would return to life and reclaim his throne. And in this scenario, Nero did indeed die. However, those who either expected or feared his return believed that it truly would be a return from the dead. Now, references to Nero aside, the purpose of verses 3 through 4 is to allude to this beast's, or Rome's, longevity and resilience. When Nero died, the empire sank into a quagmire of tumultuous violence. The Julian dynasty that had been in place since Caesar Augustus died with Nero in 68 CE. A civil war and perhaps even the dissolution of the empire itself threatened. In 69, no fewer than 4 men pursued and laid claim to the imperial throne. With the rise of power of Vespasian and his Flavian dynasty, the empire remarkably rose to new life. Like the head, the beast managed and thereby mocked resurrection. So notice throughout this, the descriptions of Rome through these various beasts and images are pseudo-Christs. Remember that later when we get to the word Antichrist. But they mirror what Jesus does in many ways. And here we have a rumor around this emperor who is said to maybe return and resume his kingdom in the Pax Romana, peace of Rome, in an almost metaphysical, spiritual sense, as a return of like a messianic figure. And there were even people who came and claimed to be Nero, and tried to convince people that they were Nero returned. And this wounding to the beast head is a reference to that. And later, there is one last thing that I think will convince us that this analysis of this chapter is correct. But we'll get to that at the end of this. Moving on to verse 5, though, more about the beast. The beast was given a mouth speaking arrogant and blasphemous words. We've already been told that. It was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. Now, by now, you probably know, I bet one of you could tell me that 42 months being half of 7 years is a measured amount of time, meaning that this time will not last forever, that God is in command of it, it has its limits, and that it being half of 7, it is an imperfection. It's the world in between where it is and where it needs to be. And so, in other words, this beast is not going to be able to do what the beast does forever. It has limits. Verse 6, it opened its mouth to speak blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. Also, it was allowed to wage war on the saints and to conquer them. It was given authority over every tribe and people and language and nation. An aside, remember that language when we get to Revelation 20 towards the end? Actually, we've also seen that language earlier, where we have every tribe, people, and nation brought together in reconciliation around the throne of God. Well, here is another pseudo Messiah, God Emperor, who exhibits similar authority over languages, tribes, and nations. And it goes on to say, and all the inhabitants of the earth will worship it. Everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb that was slaughtered. So the beast does on earth what it has been given authority to do by the dragon. It positions itself as God and carries out a war on the saints. Also, this warring power was given authority over every tribe and people and nation. This could certainly have seemed to be the case from the vantage point of John's audience. But though Rome's control seems all-encompassing, things are not as they seem. John's revelation reveals that the beast / Rome / Caesar to be a parody of the real God, who is Lord of all, who holds ultimate authority. Everyone is subjected to the wrath of the beast, save those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. This book, written from the foundation of the world, assures the saint that God will hold them from the beginning until the end. Now, I said there's no devotional or theological punchlines in today's lesson, except for this one right in the middle. In between these two images of these two beasts, John the Revelator includes as part of the vision, or rather, and aside from the vision, a saying to give instruction in the wake of what has just been described. What has just been described is a beast commissioned by the power of the dragon, Satan, the power of hell, to wreak havoc on the planet Earth and to destroy what God creates and to pull apart the church and to pull apart the saints and to do all those things. And so you would imagine after reading something like that, where's the hope? What can you do? Well, the main point of the book is to teach us that first, God has us, and should they kill us, there is a second death that we will not die. And in the meantime, here is the point in two verses. 9, let anyone who has an ear listen. If you are to be taken captive, into captivity you go. If you kill with the sword you must be killed. Here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. And no, I did not write that last line, although you might think so after everything I just said, because up until this point, I've tried to emphasize the overall purpose of this apocalypse, which is to encourage Christians to live faithfully in the face of upheaval and destruction wrought by the forces of evil. And here is one moment where Jesus makes this explicit, where John makes this explicit when he writes, here is a call of the endurance and faith of the saints. Here's a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. So he gives the interpretation. And the call? Well, the call is, if taken captive, go willingly. If they kill you with a sword, let them. For to fight fire with fire would be to use the very means by which Rome claimed and maintained rule. This way leads to destruction. Instead, saints are called to endure through such times without compromising the values of God's realm as expressed by Jesus. And if you would like a picture from the Gospels of what's going on in these two verses, kind of in a story, you may recall when Jesus was being arrested in the garden, and Peter, believing that Jesus would wield the powers of Rome as Rome wielded them, drew his sword because he was about to meet might with might as he understood power. And Jesus said, "Put away your sword. Those who live by the sword die by the sword." You have a repetition in kind of different wording here of that same sentiment. That's the call of the disciple means we may face danger or even death. And we'll have more on that this coming Sunday as we preach on another passage that calls us to take up our crosses. But the point being, don't meet might with might as the powers in our world do. It would be better for you to die with your soul clear and your heart fully given to love and goodness than to take life as so many others who destroy the earth take life. And now we move on. After that brief, I guess, sneaking a preach in there, as I say, verses 9 and 10, we move on to 11, and we have another beast that does not come from the sea, but rather comes from the earth. It reads, "Then I saw another beast that rose out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, and it makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast whose fatal wound had been healed." So here is a lamb-like beast who speaks evil. It's a parody, another parody of the lamb that was slain, Jesus Christ. Having two horns, it's not as powerful as the beast from the sea, but it's been given that beast's authority. It's as if the beast from the earth operates as the beast from the sea's emissary and representative, which, by the way, is exactly how we're meant to think of this for reasons we'll see here in a moment. But its purpose is to, quoting from the text, make the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast whose fatal wound had been healed. Now, the first beast came from the sea, thus symbolizing Rome's conquests. For John's Asian audience, remember he's writing to churches in Asia Minor. For those people, Rome would have come from across the sea. So a beast coming from the sea also was symbolic of that sort of imperial conquest, which would happen somewhat on the regular. But the second beast comes from the earth. It's local, and it comes from amidst the people, from in fact, within their own communities, if you want to think of it that way. Of this, Brian Blunt writes, "Rome, as the beast from the sea, is a foreign force. Land-based, the false prophet, the beast from the earth is a false prophet, more on that in a moment. The false prophet has a more indigenous feel. He rises up out of the very soil on which John's hearers and readers have built their lives and homes. This beast is local. It represents the native traditions and institutions that nevertheless serve the bestial imperial cults. Rome exercised its rule through such institutions." End quote. And here Heath Jones, will call to mind those stories from our Gospels where we read of localized governing forces in regions that have been conquered by Rome. Herod, Pontius Pilate, those centurions in those stories with Jesus, temple officials, etc. And these are the various false prophets leading the people away from faithfulness to God and toward the false gods held up by the Roman imperial cult. So, and it goes on to describe more about what this beast on the land will do. It performs great signs, verse 13, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in the sight of all. And by the signs that it is allowed to perform on behalf of the beast, it deceives the inhabitants of earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that had been wounded by the sword and yet lived. So make a statue of that beast that's been wounded and yet lived. Verse 15, and it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast so that the image of the beast could even speak or cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. What is he talking about? Those who lived around this time would know that he's describing the spiritual landscape. Pseudo-prophetic voices in that time implored the people to acquiesce to Rome and to worship its emperor. And there are many incentives to do so. Inclusion, citizenship, for example, was contingent on these practices. Participation in the economy in an easy way was contingent on fitting in and not in like making nice with Rome. And many priests and religious leaders claimed special powers and the ability to work magic on behalf of Rome. And these displays were meant to convince the people that Rome and its ways were worthy for their adoration and worship. And that's why I highlighted verse 13 in this. These words that at first may not make sense until you understand the history, where it says that it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast so that the image of the beast could even speak. This alludes to a practice of hollowing out sacred statues, hiding in them, or otherwise rigging them so that one could speak through them by way of ventriloquism. Writes of this Brian Blunt, this nod to Hellenistic magic is John's metaphorical way of saying that the false prophet has breathed life into a cultic system so that people believe that images populating the system can actually make a positive economic, social, political, and religious difference in their lives. Those imperial images are supposed to bring them life, a life of rewards, that a reliance upon the Lord of God and Christ could not. Again, more pseudo Christs, Christ's objects that are demanding worship that Jesus the Christ deserves, and so much so that people are willing to hollow out images and make them appear as to talk to convince people that this is where power lie, that the peace of Rome and all of that its citizenship could theoretically involve wealth, prosperity, safety. This is another, I guess, a prop to convince people that Rome is good for it. And there was a lot of this going on, sleight of hand and tricks in religious institutions throughout the Roman Empire to convince people to adhere to different cults of imperial worship. And I would say the same is true today. You find constantly in Christianity and other faiths people who are grifters and who are doing similar things. That's what's being described here. But moving on to the beast's mark, verses 16 through 17. Also, it being the beast from the sea, causes all, from the land, pardon, the beast from the land causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be given a brand. In the Greek, it's a word, charagma, on the right hand or forehead, so that no one can buy or sell who does not have the brand, that is the name of the beast or the number for its name. The reason I included the Greek charagma is to make the point that this is to describe more about what kind of mark we have in mind here. To quote from Leonard Thompson in his Revelation commentary, a charagma is an imprint such as a serpent's mark, a brand on a camel, or an impress on a coin. Both the tattoo and the seal mark the body to indicate membership in a community. For example, because of a confusion between Judaism and Dionysian religion, Jews were branded by decree by Ptolemy IV on their bodies by fire with the ivy leaf symbol of Dionysus. I'm going to pause for a moment and first cite where that story comes from 3rd Maccabees. It's a apocryphal Jewish writing. But think about, too, what that would imply for, at that time, the Greeks, imprinting, branding the people with an ivy leaf symbol of a false god as a way of subjugating the people and helping them understand where their loyalty should lie. Going back to the quote, initiates often have tattoos depicting dangerous or powerful animals such as serpents, scorpions, bulls, or lions. Here, the tattoo was either the name of the beast or the number equivalent of the name. Having the tattoo had practical implications, for without it, no one could buy or sell. That is, the sea beast controlled all commerce and trade. Now, here is where I think this is especially useful, especially if you're in conversations with somebody who's talking about various Bible prophecies and they're wanting to talk about the mark of the beast and wondering, are you, any one of us at risk of taking said mark and maybe finding ourselves outside of God's graces? When I was a child, the way it was described to me was there would be a mark that would be placed on my hand or forehead, as this text indicates, and that unless I did receive it, I would be just eternally damned. There'd be nothing I could do about it. But if I didn't, I wouldn't be able to, go to the grocery store. And this seemed, as a child, this was very, very troubling. And especially since I was given the way it was talked about was as if you wouldn't be quite sure if you knew what the mark was. Like you might take it on accident, find out after the fact. Anyway, my point is, it led to a lot of confusion. I think what I'm about to offer can clear things up in a way that I think is quite satisfying and is a lot of fun. Because you notice the mark is the name of the beast or its number, okay? So the mark is either the name or its number. We're going to discover that the number and the name are the same thing in a moment. The beast is symbolic of Rome, so therefore its mark So therefore is its mark. I make that point to say that, well, anyway, we'll get to that in a moment. Now, as I was saying, there was historic precedent for Rome, marking peoples or individuals with various marks identifying ownership or where they belonged. However, Rome never did this in mass, and nor was it ever required for commerce. Again, the mark in Revelation symbolizes the marks of inclusion into Rome's corrupt ways. It's not a literal marking or tattoo. Now, you may also recall earlier in Revelation 7 that the saints were sealed by God for protection against persecution. Just as the beast is the symbol of Rome's imperial power and evil, its mark signifies one's entrance and inclusion in its corrupt power structure. The beast's mark is as symbolic as the beast itself. John is speaking symbolically. There is no literal mark, writes Brian Blunt. The mark of the beast symbolizes a person's allegiance to and participation in the religious, social, economic, and political rights associated with the imperial cult. John is saying that those, including people in the church who participate in the worship of the emperor, have, in so doing, marked themselves as belonging to Satan. That's from Reddish's commentary on Revelation. So we're meant to understand that the beast's mark is a parody of the trustworthy mark placed on the foreheads of the saints. Back in chapter 7, will be again alluded to in chapter 14 and then verse 22. That also, I think, is why there are words earlier in this chapter encouraging those whose names are written in the book of life that they will be held through, even should they suffer persecution and suffering and even death, they will be held through, because those marked in such way will be saved. The 144,000 who bear the mark of faithfulness for the witness of Jesus as Lord are kept safe and protected from whatever may befall. Contrariwise, those marked by the beast will be defeated along with the beast. Then it goes on to tell us what the number of the beast, or quote unquote, the name of this beast is, this personage. This calls for wisdom, it says. Let anyone with understanding calculate, emphasis on calculate, the number of the beast, for it is the number for a person. Its number is 666. Now, I put a footnote, I left the footnote in here and I even highlighted it. You'll see, if you're looking at the screen, G highlighted. Does anyone, if any of you have your Bibles in front of you, do anyone of you have a footnote in this part too? Most Bibles should have it. I'm asking a question. You all can respond.
You're talking 18?
Yeah, 18. At the end of 18. Yeah, at the end of 18. Do you have a footnote at the end of its number is 666?
The idea is that it is the number of man, not of God, which means he will give account to Jehovah, whom he has repeatedly blasphemed.
Okay. Well, that, later we'll get, that is a point that's also true of this being, each number being one less than 7, the number of perfection. But does anyone else have anything that begins with other ancient authorities?
Yes.
What does that say?
Authorities omit this sentence. Other ancient authorities read 616.
In other words, and exactly, there are manuscripts of Revelation around as early as the 100s. Later, Irenaeus cites them as early as the late 2nd century, but there are manuscripts nearly as old as the earliest that instead of having 666 have the number 616. And then some omit it altogether because they seem to be wanting to save the confusion. So what gives? There is a hint in the word calculate, as I alluded to before. I'm quoting this from the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, which reads, the mysterious number 666 has attracted much attention. Jews in antiquity were fond of working out the numerical value of letters, a technique called gematria. The numerical value of the name Nero Caesar in Hebrew is 666. This interpretation has a long pedigree in the history of the interpretation of Revelation, as is confirmed by the errant reading of 616, a reading known along with 666 to the late 2nd century writer Irenaeus. One can understand the change since the Greek form Neron Caesar, written in Hebrew characters, is equivalent to 666, whereas the Latin form Nero Caesar is equivalent to 616. So gematria is this numbers game where people will find in words, assign a numerical value to letters and then find a code, like write codes or riddles in numbers and it was popular, and it was even popular with in scriptural interpretation. Sometimes people would go through old, even the Torah, and try to discern if certain words could be associated with certain numbers. And a lot of it is, finding what you want to see. But following the rules of this game as understood back then, in the Hebrew, you get Nero Caesar when you spell 666. So it says calculate the number. That's the number of a person. It's I want to know who I'm talking about. The beast, the head who was wounded and came back to life, alluding to that. But also Nero is symbolic of everything that is wrong with Rome. Nero symbolizes Rome's decadence, the time of the most intense persecution of the Christians, the most obvious rejection of the church. And so his number, if you want to know, is 666. As a sort of shorthand for describing Nero and all that is included. And the reason why he would do it in Hebrew is because the revelation is tying these images in back to the images from the Hebrew Bible, right? So those beasts in the Hebrew Bible representing Persia, Babylon, the Medes, Greece. Now we have another beast combined of all of them, symbolizing the Roman Empire. One of its heads is wounded. But since we're tapping into Hebrew scripture and Hebrew history, John makes a choice to shift from the Greek there and to spell it out in Hebrew, 666. But in the Latin, people later were like, hey, let's just keep it consistent. We're going to translate it into Latin so that more people can read it later. And it was Nero in the Latin word is 616. So it's as plain as day. I'm not even being sneaky it's fairly obvious to biblical scholars that is what's going on here, which lends it to me more credence to this idea that these beasts are being described are John's shorthand way of talking about the Roman Empire and its problems and how the saints may live well within it, which is the point of next week's lesson, where in chapter 14 we will read of the more about these beasts and the response, God's response and the church's response in chapter 14. But I have these final thoughts about this chapter. In chapter 13, John's apocalypse uses the images of bizarre beasts to give expression to the evils that surrounded him and his communities. While these images initially called a Christian's attention to the ways of Rome and empires of old, these empires are now footnotes in history. However, the patterns repeat. Governments and world leaders still claim lordship over peoples and lands that ultimately belong to God. Inclusion in most economies requires various ethical compromises in order for us to participate in them. The marks of such inclusion may include formal citizenship, patriotic pledges, and an adherence to some vague civic religion. Indeed, one's arrest by many a government may well lead to political and economic disenfranchisement. This should not surprise us. After all, such was John's fate, which is why he wrote his apocalypse in exile on Patmos. This was John's way of rejecting the beast's mark, and so he instead was marked for persecution as a faithful witness to Jesus, and as of being a faithful witness to Jesus sometimes does. And also, as I'll add something I perhaps should have written, also, this is the way of the lamb that was slain. From the start to finish, the story begins with a lamb on its feet, yet slain, despite Rome's slaying of the lamb, Jesus. Jesus is still Lord. And it's all tied into how John understands what it means to live faithful, which is to reject the marks of ownership into a system that causes you to participate in what is evil, whether it be exploiting others for labor, whether it be war making, to take land, whatever the case may be. So that was quite a lot in all of chapter 13. And again, as I said, there's no big punchline for like theological point. I just want to open it up for reflection. But my main goal here today was to just give an example where it's more obvious to me that the writer of Revelation and the Revelation has Rome in its sights as what it's offering critique of. But it's applicable in every age because Rome wasn't the first empire on the block. Several are alluded to even in today's chapter. And there is later in Revelation, the seventh head of the emperor, which is it said that the sixth head is the one that's currently. Later, we'll get to this a month and a half from now. But then it says there's another one that has not yet come, implying that, there's going to be another emperor. But that emperor, says the writer of Revelation, will be the end of it, the seventh, marking completeness. Again, symbolic, not literal, because there were far more than one after Dionysius at the time of this writing. I don't know. Did I obscure or make clear? Help me out.
Yeah. Well,
I would say clarified. I was knowing that the Revelation is not a prophetic work. I
As in
couldn't help
future
but
time,
think of our
as in
current political situation.
yeah. I would say it's prophetic, and it does give us some indication about what may come next. So you can look into the future with it, using based on what we learned from this and how humans behave and the response of the church back then and the witness of the saints. How can it prophetically speak into our lives now and give us some guidance for the coming, months, years as Christians, days? And I would say the message is the same today. Endure. When you said it's not prophetic, I was being more technical. I know what you meant, Larry. It's not telling us the future as prescribed. Yeah, as prescribed, Les laid out hundreds of years of millennia, but more. My favorite anecdote, and was the one that was the most helpful for me as a young person who was still scared of this book before I learned this, was the line about 666, because that is very demonstrable. You can find, I couldn't find a Bible commentary in this church that didn't include some reference to that. That they're talking about gematria and the point that 616 is Nero in Latin, Nero Caesar in Latin, and 666 is Nero Caesar in Greek, in the Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's handy to have because it's very simple to explain, and what with the context of the head that was wounded, giving more, and that would have happened just a few decades before the writing of this book, this letter.
Yeah, the 6116 was totally new to me. I hadn't heard that.
Yeah. There are manuscripts as old as the 2nd century that have that, because they were just trying to figure out, Latin speaking people were like, that's not right. They got the math wrong. It said calculate the name. They got it wrong. And so they corrected it to be spelled out in Latin because they knew it was Nero back then. We lost that knowledge over the course of centuries. Now we say maybe it's Mao, if we were back in the Cold War, or maybe it's, it depends on what time you're living, you find. But at the same time, I would go ahead.
I once heard a person speaking on the number of things, and he started out and he said, well, if I take my name and I do this, and I get 666. And if I take Sally's name over here, I do this, I get 6666. That it's not, it's in there. I'm sure it means something, but I'm not sure that we're able to understand what it means. And I don't think it's necessary that we understand what it means. To them, it was probably important, but I think today it's not important.
It's not important to know specifically who it is. And I think that's hugely helpful because a lot of people that raised me are very interested in finding out who specifically. And I heard in camp meetings and revivals, different popular figures named as potential antichrists. Usually it was whoever were the leaders in an opponent's political party tended to be the antichrist.
The lead.
You know what I mean? Usually that tended to be, usually it was and it's because people feel really ominous feelings around the intentions of who they perceive to be their adversaries. And so, whenever Bill Clinton won, it felt like the end of the world to people. It felt like and then with the rise of the internet, it was, connecting the world. I mean, I had all this talk growing up, but here's where it is helpful today. Who is operating what political powers, entities, persons in the same beast-like fashion that Rome did.
Putin.
What political? Well, you got it. And many others.
Yeah.
And so it is descriptive to our times because you find who are the figures that best reflect these values today. And the call for Christians is the same. And that's where it does get preachy. Live faithfully, persevere, be a witness to Jesus Christ. If they kill you, they can't really kill you.
Mm-mm.
And I should have in an earlier lesson, and I haven't figured out where to place it. I'll say it now, but there's going to be a time where I'm going to do like an explainer on the first and second death. I should have done it. It's not just in Revelation, but it's reflected in Revelation where the first death is the death everyone dies. It's the death that we mortals die and we're buried, and everyone will do that. The second death is what happens when the end of it all, when God metes out justice and what cannot be reconciled or redeemed and who cannot be reconciled and redeemed are in the Revelation thrown into the abyss. There are different thoughts about what happens, and I won't get into that now. But as I was sorry, I lost my thought mid-thought. Revelation.
Yeah, I'm
Help me out.
surprised. We in my prayer group on go ahead, Nancy.
Well, I want to finish. Oh, I remember now. Second death. The second death is that. And Christians, those who are faithful witnesses, don't die that. In fact, they experience a life that is richer, and that's what we read about at the end of Revelation. And so John wants us to know that the first death is terrible to die, but there are worse things. And a worse thing would be to get caught up in the evil ways of Rome and to compromise and to expand on Rome's influence and its subjugation and rather than fight it and resist it. So that plays that has application in any age.
Yeah.
Revelation is a very timely book for us right now because our world feels a lot like these word pictures and all their confusion and all of the
world is just evil right now.
feels overwhelming. But if Revelation teaches us wisdom and it's included, remember there were times where people thought it shouldn't have been included in the canon, from Martin Luther to early church fathers way back in the first centuries. But I'm glad it made it for such a time as this. And there are other times it fits too.
Yeah.
Because when the world feels like it's coming down on your head, the message of Revelation is, hold on, God is just, God is sovereign.
There's a happy ending.
Yeah.
On Friday, I have a prayer group, and our leader is having us pray for every nation in the country, on the earth. And I am still surprised how many dictatorships there are.
Yeah.
And I'm shocked to hear today about Nicaragua, how the missionaries were there and they arrested them and they put the leaders in the pastors that were there that belonged there in Nicaragua. They put them in jail, and now they didn't say this was a dictatorship, but that's what it's sounding like to me because they've lost their freedom of religion. So
the persecution of Jesuits in South America is well documented through these last 60, 70 years, mostly by governments that were colluding with global corporations, even United States corporations like fruit companies and whatnot, where we would fund our militias to go down and train them to overthrow governments and put in place dictatorships. Oscar Romero is just sainted about 5 years ago, but he was one such saint that was shot during Mass, was assassinated during Mass while the people were worshiping for his opposition to the dictatorship that his people were under. So they were living out this book of Revelation. There's a witness. That's exactly it. And those people got arrested. It's a witness. And that's exactly it. And
yeah, it's It's just our life. It is what it is right now.
But
And
the message
we
of
read the
Revelation
book.
is it happens for 42 months,
Yeah.
time and half a time, limits. It does not go on forever. The complete comes.
Yeah.
And when it does, we will see our salvation. That's what we cling to in hope and faith.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Revelation is a book of hope. I promise. I promise.
Well, what does it say at the beginning? That whoever reads the book of Revelation shall be blessed. Very first part of chapter 1.
Yeah.
I can't even find the beginning. The pages are too thick. Whoever reads this, and they who hear the words of this prophecy, and keep these things which are written therein, for the time at hand. Okay, where's the rest of that sentence? I don't know. Where'd it go? So, but it says, I know it says in here that if you read it, you will be blessed.
Well, that's a good note to end on if all hearts are cleared. We're almost at 8 o'clock. I cut you off way earlier, Larry, when you were, because I wanted to insert my pedantic point about prophet. I'm sorry if I did that. And did you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
Oh, not really, except one, again, I'm guessing going to be political. One thing I got remembered when we were talking about the dragon and everything, I remember a big Republican conservative conference when Trump was still president. And you walked into the main hall and the cameraman is walking down the hall. And one of the things you see among the displays is this sort of a miniature cartoony version of Trump that looks like it's gold plated and in his golfing costume. And then my immediate response was, the golden calf arrives again.
I think I think we should be hesitant to put any of our political leaders in stone, especially while they're still alive.
Yeah.
And well, thank you for this lesson. Thank you for allowing me to share these things with you. As I said, this was one of those that was more academic than devotional, although we did end up reflecting on a lot of its application to our own life, which is
Okay,
the
I found
point.
it. It says, blessed is he who reads and those that hear the words of this prophecy and keep these things which are written in it, for the time is near.
That is a good place to end if all hearts are clear. Does anyone
That's right.
else have any questions or things they would like to add? All right. Well,
Okay.
be a witness. I'll see you. I'll see some of you tomorrow morning, probably.
Yep. Okay.
Take care.